The bustling corridors of Grand Horizon Mall were filled with the usual weekend chaos. Shoppers moving from store to store, children laughing, and a faint hum of music from the speakers above. Among the crowd, Mrs. Clara Jenkins, an elderly woman with a quiet grace, strolled slowly with her cane, unaware that her peaceful day would soon erupt into a shocking confrontation. In one swift moment, a hand-raised authority crossed the line of decency, leaving a mark that would ignite a city, a nation, and a digital world watching with disbelief. This is the story of a single act of violence that revealed the fragility of justice and the enduring power of courage. The sun had barely risen above the city skyline, spilling warm golden light through the glass ceiling of Grand Horizon Mall. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with the soft hum of conversation, the rhythmic clicking of heels on polished floors, and the distant jingle of cash registers. Shoppers drifted from store to store, their hands carrying bags adorned with brand logos, and children tugged at parent hands, eyes wide at the colorful displays and festive decorations. It was an ordinary Saturday morning, filled with ordinary routines, until a moment shattered the illusion of calm. In the middle of this ordinary bustle walked Mrs. Clara Jenkins, an 80-year-old woman whose presence, though unassuming, carried the weight of decades. Her gait was steady but careful, a slow shuffle aided by the worn wooden cane she gripped with both hands. Her dark skin, marked by age and resilience, bore the stories of life lived through both hardship and triumph. She moved quietly, pausing occasionally to admire a window display or adjust the scarf draped over her shoulders. To the casual observer, she was just another shopper enjoying a day out, but for some, she represented something entirely different. Officer Daniel Price had been patrolling the mall for over 4 hours, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. In his mid-30s, he carried himself with a rigidity that seemed to echo authority, a sense of power that often masked an undercurrent of prejudice. Price had walked these corridors countless times, issuing warnings, questioning shoplifters, and maintaining a presence that many claimed was reassuring. Yet there was a coldness in his eyes, a quickness to assume guilt before fact. It began innocuously, almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Jenkins paused at the entrance of a small boutique, her eyes drawn to a sale sign offering discounts on winter coats. She adjusted her scarf and pushed her cane lightly against the floor, a rhythmical tap that harmonized with the soft background music. From a distance, Officer Price noticed her hesitating near the doorway and felt a twinge of suspicion. He had seen types of people loiter in stores before, and without hesitation, he approached. "Excuse me, ma'am," Price said, his voice carrying authority but lacking warmth. Mrs. Jenkins looked up, startled, her eyes meeting his with gentle curiosity rather than fear. "Yes, officer," she replied, her tone polite, tinged with the natural hesitation of someone being interrupted. "You can't just stand there," he said sharply, gesturing toward the boutique's entrance. "People have reported suspicious behavior in this area. Step aside." Mrs. Jenkins blinked, taken aback. Suspicious? She hadn't even entered the store. Her day had begun with nothing but intent to shop quietly and perhaps pick up a small gift for her granddaughter. She opened her mouth to respond, but Price cut her off, his expression hardening. "I said step aside," he repeated, this time leaning closer, the edge in his tone unmistakable. A few bystanders noticed the interaction. A young couple stopped mid-walk, exchanging worried glances. A teenager clutching a phone raised it discreetly, sensing that something troubling was unfolding. The mall's usual hum seemed to waver, replaced by the tension of anticipation, as if the air itself held its breath. Mrs. Jenkins, her voice trembling slightly, tried to explain, "I'm not doing anything wrong, officer. I'm just—" But Price's patience had already dissolved into aggression. "Don't talk back to me," he barked. "You think you can just ignore the law?" The words hit like a clap of thunder. Passers-by began murmuring, their whispers swelling into a cacophony of concern. Yet in the center of it all, Mrs. Jenkins stood firm, her cane still clutched tightly, her heart racing. There was no malice in her actions, no defiance beyond the simple act of existing in the space she had every right to occupy. Then, without further warning, Officer Price's hand shot out. The sharp slap landed across Mrs. Jenkins's cheek with force that made her stagger. The sound echoed through the atrium like a gunshot, silencing the surrounding crowd for a heartbeat before chaos erupted. Her hand flew to her face, eyes wide with shock and pain. "Oh my God!" a woman exclaimed, clutching her shopping bag tightly. "Did you just—" Another bystander, a young man recording the incident, muttered under his breath, "This is insane! Someone call security!" The old woman's lips trembled, not just from the physical sting, but from the weight of indignity and fear that surged through her. Her eyes filled with tears, a mixture of hurt and disbelief painting her expression for everyone to see. She had lived long enough to endure hardship, to face injustice in various forms. But nothing had prepared her for the public humiliation in a place meant for leisure and safety. Price, breathing heavily, seemed oblivious to the growing chorus of voices around him. His focus remained on asserting control, his actions justifying themselves in his mind as maintaining order. But the mall was alive with witnesses now, all watching, some filming, all silently judging. Security personnel finally arrived. 2 men in navy blue uniforms, their eyes darting between the elderly woman and the officer. "Sir, please step back," one of them said cautiously, placing a hand on Price's shoulder. "Let's de-escalate this." Price hesitated, his jaw tight, but the weight of scrutiny began to creep into his posture. Bystanders formed a loose circle, murmuring in indignation, there present a subtle yet undeniable form of accountability. Mrs. Jenkins, holding herself upright despite the shock, whispered to no one in particular, "I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything wrong." The mall, which had started as a place of routine and leisure, had become an arena of tension, its air thick with disbelief and outrage. In those few minutes, the ordinary Saturday transformed into an event that would not be forgotten, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of Grand Horizon Mall. And so it began, the incident that would ignite conversations, debates, and a demand for justice. A single slap, meant to assert control, had instead sparked attention, confrontation, and an unflinching gaze upon prejudice. Mrs. Clara Jenkins, with dignity in her trembling hands and courage in her eyes, became an unwitting symbol of resilience in the face of blatant injustice. The mall, bustling just moments ago, now held its collective breath. Eyes watched, hearts raced, and somewhere deep inside, the first whispers of outrage began to spread. The incident, tense and shocking, had already planted the seeds of what would become a storm. The echo of the slap lingered in the air like an unwelcome shadow, making even the brightest lights of Grand Horizon Mall feel dim and oppressive. For a brief moment, time seemed to fracture, and everyone present froze, caught between disbelief and the urgent need to respond. Mrs. Clara Jenkins stood in the center of the atrium, her hand trembling on her cheek, her eyes wide with shock, as though trying to process the impossible. Pain radiated through her face, sharp and insistent, but it was a humiliation, the public violation, that seared deeper. Around her, bystanders reacted in waves of confusion and indignation. A young couple nearby whispered frantically to each other, their hands shaking as they instinctively pulled out their phones. "We need to record this. Someone needs to see," the woman said, her voice quivering with a mixture of fear and urgency. Her partner hesitated, glancing toward Officer Price, whose stance remained rigid and defensive. "Do it quietly. He might get aggressive," he muttered. Others gasped audibly, some audibly clapping hands to their mouths in shock. Children clung to their parents, sensing the tension before they fully understood it. An elderly man, leaning heavily on a cane himself, whispered under his breath, "This isn't right. It's never right." His eyes were fixed on Mrs. Jenkins, worry etched deep into the lines of his face. A middle-aged woman, clutching a shopping bag in one hand, stepped forward cautiously. "Sir, you cannot do that." "She's an elderly woman," she exclaimed, her voice sharp and incredulous. Price's eyes flicked toward her, a brief flare of irritation crossing his face, but he did not step back. Instead, he squared his shoulders, as if the crowd were invisible and the rules applied only to Mrs. Jenkins. Mall security had arrived, but their movements were hesitant and uncertain. 2 uniformed guards stood a few meters away, their hands awkwardly resting at their sides. "Sir, ma'am, please calm down," one of them said, attempting neutrality in a situation that demanded decisiveness. Price's glare cut through them like a knife. "Step aside. This doesn't concern you," he said, his voice low but laced with threat. Meanwhile, whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into urgent discussions, and the crowd thickened around the unfolding drama. Some people began recording the event, their phones raised cautiously, hands slightly shaking. One young man narrated softly into his camera. "You're seeing it live. This officer just hit an elderly woman for no reason, right here at Grand Horizon Mall." Another woman filmed from across the atrium, her voice breaking as she muttered, "I can't believe this. She didn't do anything." The act itself had ignited a storm of emotions in those witnessing it. Shock, fear, anger, and empathy collided in the faces of strangers, creating an almost tangible tension that pulsed through the crowd. Many wanted to intervene physically, but fear held them back. Officer Price was not just a man in uniform. He represented authority, and defying him could provoke further violence. Yet the desire to protect Mrs. Jenkins was overwhelming, manifested in gestures of support. Hands hovering near hers, words shouted across the space, and eyes that dared to hold his gaze. Mrs. Jenkins, still holding her cheek, took a tentative step backward. Her cane clicked against the polished tiles, the sound small but resonant amidst the murmurs. Pain radiated from her jaw and neck, but it was an emotional weight that made her knees threaten to buckle. She tried to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, please stop. I didn't do anything." But the words were swallowed by the growing chaos, lost among the sea of voices clamoring to make sense of what had just occurred. A group of teenagers had gathered nearby, their curiosity mixed with moral outrage. Some filmed while others muttered expletives under their breath, angry at the injustice they were witnessing. "This is insane," one said, eyes glued to the screen of his phone as he panned across the scene. "How can someone just slap her like that? She's old. She can't even defend herself properly." Their laughterless exclamations carried a bitter edge of disbelief and helplessness. Security personnel attempted to intervene again, this time more assertively, moving closer to Price. "Sir, you need to step aside now. You're not supposed to hit shoppers," one guard said, raising his voice to be heard over the murmurs. Price, unyielding, shifted slightly, his posture defensive but his eyes scanning for perceived threats. The crowd noticed the hesitation, their murmurs growing louder, tinged with incredulity at the slow, ineffective response. Amidst the turmoil, some shoppers tried to comfort Mrs. Jenkins. A young woman knelt beside her, offering tissues and gently urging her to sit on a nearby bench. "It's going to be okay," she said softly, though her voice trembled. "Help is coming, you're not alone." Mrs. Jenkins shook her head faintly, her eyes glistening with tears. The physical pain was sharp, but it was a violation, the injustice of being publicly humiliated for no reason, that clung to her heart. The mall, once a place of commerce and casual leisure, had transformed into a stage of confrontation and moral tension. Some people whispered to each other about calling the police again, this time the Internal Affairs Division, while others debated whether to post the videos online immediately. Each recording device, held at arm's length, represented a potential witness, a potential evidence, and a growing catalyst for the wider world to witness what had unfolded within these walls. Mrs. Jenkins tried to steady herself, gripping her cane firmly, each movement deliberate and careful. I didn't do anything," she whispered again, more to convince herself than anyone else. Around her, the murmurs continued, growing louder as bystanders voiced their outrage. "Why is he allowed to do this?" one man shouted. "This is abuse." The tension reached a breaking point when Price finally raised his hand, as if to assert further authority, but hesitated, glancing around at the growing circle of witnesses. The sight of dozens of smartphones capturing his actions seemed to make him reconsider his next move. Mall security took this opportunity to step between him and Mrs. Jenkins, guiding him backward slightly, their own discomfort clear in their hesitant movements. Even as he moved, the crowd's reactions persisted. Shoppers exchanged worried glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others muttering under their breath about systemic injustice. Mrs. Jenkins sat slowly on the bench, still clutching her cheek, her breathing shallow but controlled. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, some horrified, some compassionate, all now a testament to the moral outrage that had been ignited by a single act of violence. The immediate aftermath was chaotic, tense, and emotional. Pain and fear clung to Mrs. Jenkins like a second skin, while shock and anger rippled through every witness. Though the slap had been brief, its effects spread like wildfire, touching hearts, prompting phones to record, and setting in motion a chain of events that no one could yet fully grasp. In that moment, amidst the murmurs, the recordings, and the hurried interventions, it became clear that this incident was not just a private act of aggression. It was a public spectacle of injustice, captured in real time by ordinary people who were unwilling to look away. The mall, once a space of normalcy, had become the epicenter of outrage, and Mrs. Jenkins, fragile yet dignified, had become its unwilling symbol. By the afternoon, the incident at Grand Horizon Mall had transcended the confines of polished floors and glass ceilings. The brief, shocking moment, Officer Daniel Price slapping Mrs. Clara Jenkins, had been captured on multiple smartphones, and in the age of social media, that single act of violence was no longer contained. Videos posted to platforms spread with alarming speed, their views climbing by the minute. Notifications pinged relentlessly as shares, likes, and comments multiplied, transforming a local confrontation into a digital storm. The first clip, filmed by a teenager from the food court, showed the moment Price's hand struck Mrs. Jenkins. The sound of the slap, sharp and jarring, was almost deafening in the video. "This can't be real," a caption read, paired with a trembling camera angle that captured Mrs. Jenkins recoiling, tears forming in her eyes. Within minutes, it had hundreds of views, and within an hour, thousands. The comment section erupted. Outrage, disbelief, and calls for immediate action poured in from users across the country. Hashtag Justice for Clara quickly began trending. Ordinary citizens joined in, sharing their own reflections on what they had witnessed, their frustration spilling into posts of solidarity. "This is unacceptable," one user typed. "No one, especially an elderly woman, should face such brutality. We demand accountability." Another wrote, "I don't care who he is. That is abuse. That is racism." Activists, already monitoring issues of systemic injustice, seized the moment. The video was reposted with commentary, analyses of the prevalence of racial bias in law enforcement, statistics about elder abuse, and calls for reform in police oversight. Tweets tagged local authorities, demanding immediate suspension and investigation. Instagram reels and TikTok clips dissected the incident frame by frame, highlighting the aggression, the lack of immediate intervention by mall security, and emotional devastation on Mrs. Jenkins's face. News outlets, initially slow to pick up on the story, soon raced to cover the viral sensation. Local reporters arrived at the mall, cameras in hand, interviews with shocked bystanders rolling live. National news channels followed, broadcasting footage of the event interspersed with commentary from legal experts, civil rights advocates, and community leaders. The narrative was clear. An elderly woman had been assaulted, and the video evidence left no room for doubt. The story rapidly escalated from a local incident to a nationwide conversation about police conduct, racial injustice, and public accountability. In parallel, ordinary people felt compelled to voice their anger in real time. Social media became a form of collective outrage. Some expressed disbelief at the brazenness of the act. "I can't believe this happened in broad daylight," one tweet read. Others shared personal experiences of racial profiling or discrimination, drawing lines between their own encounters and the assault witnessed in the video. "This is the tip of the iceberg," a comment stated. "How many more elders, people of color, are suffering in silence?" The power of hashtag became evident as hashtag Justice for Clara and hashtag accountability now surged across platforms. Each new post amplified the reach, connecting people from different cities, states, and even countries. Videos of peaceful protests were shared, alongside calls for online petitions demanding that Officer Price face immediate disciplinary action. The digital world was ablaze with moral urgency, a collective insistence that wrongdoing could not be hidden behind a uniform. Newsrooms, responding to the viral nature of the content, scrambled to verify details and report responsibly. Interviews with eyewitnesses painted a fuller picture, bystanders describing the fear and confusion, the slow response of mall security, and Mrs. Jenkins' quiet dignity in the aftermath. Legal analysts dissected the potential charges the officer could face, discussing assault, abuse of authority, and civil rights violations. Experts on racial justice framed the incident within a broader historical context, connecting it to systemic patterns of prejudice in law enforcement. Meanwhile, activists organized online campaigns to support Mrs. Jenkins directly. Fundraisers were initiated to cover her medical expenses and any legal costs she might incur. Community groups shared her story, urging people to participate in virtual forums, donate to relevant organizations, or sign petitions calling for the officer's suspension and investigation. The digital response was as rapid as it was relentless. The incident that had taken place in mere seconds now had consequences that seemed to ripple infinitely across social networks. Anger simmered into action. Social media users began tagging local government officials, demanding statements. City council members, caught off guard by the speed of dissemination, released formal responses, promises of investigations, assurances of accountability, and expressions of concern for Mrs. Jenkins' well-being. The officer's department issued a terse statement, attempting to balance acknowledgement with denial, but the court of public opinion had already formed its verdict. The narrative was not about defending Price. It was about ensuring justice for Clara, the elderly woman whose dignity had been violated in the public eye. Memes, commentary threads, and video edits proliferated, each one keeping the incident in the digital spotlight. Humor mingled with rage, satire with solemnity, as the public attempted to process both the shock of violence and the broader implications of systemic racism. For some, the viral content became a teaching moment, shared in classrooms, community forums, and online discussion groups. Schools, civic organizations, and advocacy groups dissected the incident, using it as a springboard to discuss consent, authority, and the responsibilities of those who wield power over others. As the hours passed, the conversation expanded beyond outrage to reflection. People debated not just the individual act of violence, but the environment that allowed it to occur. Discussions about training, accountability, and the importance of bystander intervention emerged in comment threads and live broadcasts. Social media had become both a witness and a catalyst, amplifying voices that might otherwise have remained unheard and forcing institutions to respond under public scrutiny. The public pressure forced authorities to take decisive action. Officer Price was formally charged with assault and abuse of authority, a rare but significant step in a case of this magnitude. The charges, announced at a press conference, were met with applause and tears from the crowd outside the courthouse. Legal analysts emphasized that while charges were a critical step, the broader systemic issues, the implicit biases, lack of accountability, and patterns of misconduct remained to be addressed. Within the department, conversations began about retraining, oversight, and the need to rebuild public trust. Meetings were convened to discuss reforms, implicit bias training, more robust reporting mechanisms for misconduct, and enhanced procedures for interactions with vulnerable populations, including the elderly. For many officers, the viral incident served as a stark reminder that policing required not only authority but empathy, awareness, and accountability. For Mrs. Jenkins, the legal proceedings were both daunting and empowering. She navigated interviews with attorneys, provided formal statements, and cooperated with investigations, all while managing the emotional toll of reliving the incident repeatedly. Yet through it all, she maintained her composure, determined to ensure that her experience would lead to tangible change. In her quiet way, she became an advocate, not only for herself but for countless others who might face similar injustice without the protective glare of social media. The city, meanwhile, wrestled with reflection. Town halls, community forums, and civic panels examined the incident, exploring how racism, ageism, and unchecked authority could converge in public spaces. Ordinary citizens engage in dialogues about ethics, responsibility, and justice, using the incident as a case study to advocate for vigilance and accountability. The slap in the mall had catalyzed more than outrage. It had initiated a critical examination of societal structures and the urgent need for reform. By the end of the week, the narrative had shifted from a single act of violence to a broader dialogue about policing, social responsibility, and community engagement. Officer Price remained suspended, facing formal charges and intense public scrutiny, while Mrs. Jenkins continued to navigate the process with grace and resilience. The investigation, still ongoing, symbolized both the slow machinery of justice and the relentless demand of society unwilling to tolerate abuse. In the quiet moments, when cameras were off and the crowds had dispersed, Mrs. Jenkins reflected on the ordeal. Pain and indignity still lingered, but so did a sense of purpose. Her willingness to participate in the investigation, to speak her truth, and to insist on accountability, had turned a moment of personal violation into a catalyst for collective awareness. The system was not flawless, and justice was not guaranteed, but the combination of public scrutiny, institutional responsibility, and individual courage offered hope that change, incremental, imperfect, but real, was possible. Grand Horizon Mall had returned to a semblance of normalcy, shoppers browsing stores and children laughing, yet the shadow of that moment persisted. The slap that had once silenced Mrs. Jenkins' afternoon now echoed across the city and the nation, a reminder that accountability was not just about punishment. It was about confronting systemic flaws, demanding reform, and recognizing humanity in every interaction. Months had passed since that fateful morning in Grand Horizon Mall, yet the memory of it remained vivid for Mrs. Clara Jenkins. The sting of the officer's hand, the shock of public humiliation, and the physical pain she endured were still present, though softened by time and support. More than the slap itself, it was a realization that justice was not automatic. It required courage, advocacy, and an unwavering refusal to remain silent. In the quiet of her home, surrounded by family photos and mementos of a life well lived, Clara reflected on what had transpired and the journey it had initiated, not just for herself, but for the community around her. In the immediate aftermath, Clara had wrestled with anger and grief. She had felt violated, vulnerable, and profoundly disappointed in a system that was meant to protect citizens, not harm them. But as the days turned into weeks, she began to channel her emotions into something constructive. With the guidance of her attorneys and support from community activists, she participated in interviews, spoke at town halls, and shared her story at forums designed to educate both the public and policymakers. She realized that her voice, amplified by the viral footage, had the power to influence discourse in ways she had never imagined. "I don't want anyone else to feel powerless," she told a small gathering of local activists, her voice steady but soft. "We must speak up when we see injustice, even when it's scary or uncomfortable. If we remain silent, nothing changes." Clara's advocacy was not about vengeance. It was about creating systemic awareness. She wanted the story of her experience to serve as a catalyst for change, for others to see that dignity must never be negotiable, regardless of age, race, or circumstance. Across the city, the conversation she had helped spark continued to evolve. Community forums explored the intersection of racism and ageism, examining how elderly members of marginalized communities often face unique vulnerabilities. Panels included legal experts, social workers, educators, and former law enforcement officers who reflected candidly on systemic shortcomings. People shared stories, statistics were analyzed, and ideas for reform began to take shape. The discourse was sometimes uncomfortable, forcing the public to confront entrenched biases and institutional failings, but it was also hopeful, a recognition that dialogue was the first step toward meaningful change. The police department itself had initiated significant reforms. Officer Daniel Price faced trial, and while the legal process unfolded, the department instituted mandatory retraining programs focused on bias awareness, de-escalation techniques, and respectful engagement with vulnerable populations, including the elderly. Policies regarding civilian complaints were overhauled, with faster response times and clearer channels for reporting misconduct. Surveillance and accountability mechanisms were strengthened, ensuring that incidents like the one Clara endured would be documented and addressed promptly. Public engagement played a crucial role in these reforms. Citizens who had once only watched from their screens became advocates for policy change, attending city council meetings, submitting petitions, and participating in workshops designed to educate law enforcement personnel about community concerns. Clara herself attended several of these sessions, not as a victim, but as a knowledgeable participant whose lived experience demanded attention. Her insights, rooted in both the trauma she endured and her enduring resilience, lend authenticity and urgency to the reform efforts.